Hey everybody, welcome to the very last video for this course. So let me turn now to thinking about the course as a whole and just wrap things up for you. Theory, we have been seeing, and we could just remind ourselves, is a phenomenon that applies to most disciplines in the arts and the humanities. I take it that most of you, if not all of you, are English majors and that you encounter this course as part of your English, well, major or minor or concentration, that you're interested in English as a discipline. But even if you were not, literary theory applies, and certainly the names associated with literary theory, Nietzsche, Saussure, Foucault, Derrida, these are names that you encounter in a lot of different disciplines. So it's a phenomenon. It's been going on since the 1960s that really you run into here and there, and is worth knowing about, absolutely worth knowing about, so you can understand the nature and the texture of many contemporary conversations. But theory is also a strand of inquiry that can be traced all the way back to the ancient world. I like to say that all theorizing is classicizing. And we've seen this over and over again, from Derrida to Freud to Nietzsche. They are engaged with some ancient ideas that they find in writers like Sophocles, the Greek tragedians. They're simply taking up ideas that have already been thought by people like Sophocles and by Plato and Aristotle and others. Remember, when you think of theory, to have a timeline in your mind. In this course, I would say that there are 3 times in particular that really stand out. The time of the Greeks, time of the Enlightenment, and then the 1960s. These ideas, as I say, get going already in Greek thought. So that's an important point of reference. For Derrida and Rifkin and Ryan draw attention to this, the pre-Socratic philosophers, before Plato, before Socrates, are important as well. But anyway, that time period in history initiates the Western tradition of philosophy, and is important for thinking about theory, literary theory, cultural theory, whatever it may be. Another time period that really stands out for this course is the time period known as the Enlightenment. We've talked a little bit about Immanuel Kant. I've given you a reading from Thomas Sprat, who is writing the history of the Royal Society for Science in 1667. So we've gestured to Descartes. These are all figures associated with the development of interest in secularity, in scientific humanism, in what is called generally the project of modernity, that word, and specifically the term enlightenment, the notion of coming to know, coming to trust our rational capacities and to apply them in a cool and detached kind of way. So the period associated with the 17th and 18th centuries in particular. And then, as we saw right from the get-go when we were doing feminism and critical race theory, the 1960s as a watershed, when people like Foucault and Derrida were beginning to write, and their ideas were beginning to be very influential. Movements like the student riots in Paris and in Berkeley really initiated a new way of thinking, or a new fashion at least, that developed into literary theory. So those 3 times in particular have been very important for this course. Theory in general confronts the question, what do we think we mean by rationality? What counts as rationality? And is rationality really reliable? What is the self? Are there limits to my capacity to know myself and therefore to know? Right? Is the cogito reliable? Do I have access to the world? Or am I fundamentally unknown to myself? Do I deceive myself? Freudian psychoanalysis really comes into its own in this regard. The idea that there's an id within us that we repress, that we do not entirely know. Forces within us that we do not entirely know and are fearful that we cannot entirely control. Here, I think figures like Nietzsche and Freud are especially important for this course. Another way of thinking about theory, though, is to go in a different direction from Nietzsche and Freud and to think about knowledge as belonging to. Now, this too represents a challenge to the assumptions of the Enlightenment. But we don't get bogged down in some of the more sinister, I think, implications of mainstream theoretical thought, implications that have to do with language and rationality is always involved in forms of violence. But the critique of the Enlightenment project is nonetheless alive in this form as well, and is very basic to what is going on in theory. Remember that literature itself has been asking these questions all along, that it itself calls into question, what is it that we assume is important? What is it that we think is the nature of reality? What do we know? And so it's no surprise that Freud reads Sophocles or that Lacan reads Poe. There is a natural affinity between philosophical thought, theoretical thought, and literary thought. But one of the questions that emerges is, should literature have a capital L? I'm thinking here especially of that reading by Barbara Johnson and her reminding us that at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, theory was aware of literature as seeing itself as a replacement religion, and it didn't want that. There was an active need to undermine an overweening confidence in humanistic studies, and that's very much part of what theory is doing, undermining that confidence, again, based on notions like limited understanding of the self or limited understanding of an ability to control language. Okay, so what I've asked you to do for this week is not in the syllabus, but is in the last suggested reading in the course text. And I think if I encourage you to do this, it would round out your experience of the course and give you a bit of a review itself of what we've been doing. The pages in my book, and then this reading from there's a reading from Terry Eagleton that appears on Learn. It's in week 12 under the heading of readings, and we've seen Eagleton before. We've done a little reading from him, and this is the very start of that book. The book is called After Theory, and Eagleton is one of the most important of contemporary theorists. I mean, he's aged now; he's in his 70s, but he wrote a book in the early 80s called An Introduction to Literary Theory that was massively influential, more influential than any other theory book. He comes back to it now with this book, After Theory, and for some it sounds like he's recanting, that he's rejecting theory, but he's not. He is saying, okay, we've established that theory is important as part of the study of literature. Now, how has that happened? and what's the work that still needs to be done. I especially want you to notice what he brings up towards the end of the reading. And I cut it off before we get to the end of the chapter, but he draws attention to how there is something obviously problematic about mainstream theory's philosophical program, however fashionable it may be. He draws attention to the implications of really not trusting language, of if language is has the inherent problems that Nietzsche and Foucault and Derrida think it does, then he's got some very funny things that he says about the implications of that. Eagleton is a very witty, very entertaining reader, and he really is showing that in that's really on display throughout these pages. So do pay particular attention and think hard about what he is saying in those closing pages of the reading. Now, if you've enjoyed this course, I hope you have. I hope it's been a good experience for you. Strange circumstances with COVID, are not being able to be together. I hope the workload has been manageable. If you've enjoyed this course, you might be interested in my course 309A, Rhetoric from the Classical Period to the Enlightenment. It's not a direct follow-on from 251, but it very much takes up the issues that I've raised in this course. We do some more work on Gadamer, for example, and we really fill in that space between the classical period and the Enlightenment, which in the West is dominated by a theory of interpretation, a theory of reading that is promoted by Augustine and is then furthered by Thomas Aquinas. And this context is part of what is lost with the, well, not lost, but is downplayed and revised in what is called the passage to modernity. Bye for now. Okay, bye-bye.